Picture this. A man stands at the edge of a pit filled with venomous serpents, knowing these are his final moments on earth. But instead of begging for mercy, he smiles. This man is Ragnar Lothbrok, and his death is about to ignite one of history's most brutal revenge campaigns. But here's what most people don't know. Ragnar's journey from a simple farmer to legendary king holds secrets about human ambition, courage, and legacy that could transform how you view your own potential. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes dying the right way is more powerful than living safely. In the windswept fjords of Kattegat, around 790 AD, lived a man whose restless spirit would reshape the medieval world. Ragnar Lothbrok wasn't born into royalty or blessed with divine heritage. He was a farmer, his hands calloused from working. The harsh Scandinavian soil, his back bent from years of labor that barely kept his family fed through the brutal Nordic winters. But while other men accepted their fate, Ragnar possessed something dangerous, an imagination that refused boundaries. Every spring, he watched the traditional raiding parties sail east toward the familiar shores of the Baltic, following routes their fathers and grandfathers had taken for generations. The spoils were predictable, meager, barely enough to justify the risks. Yet the earls continued these expeditions, because that's how things had always been done. Ragnar saw differently. He spent countless nights studying the flight patterns of ravens, observing how they disappeared westward toward the endless horizon. Ancient legends spoke of lands beyond the western seas, but most dismissed these as myths, not Ragnar. He became obsessed with a radical idea. What if there were rich, undefended lands waiting across the Western Ocean? When he shared his vision with Earl Haraldsson, the local ruler laughed him out of the Great Hall. "You're a farmer, Ragnar. Leave exploration to your betters." But humiliation only fueled his determination. In secret, he began designing revolutionary ships, vessels longer and more flexible than traditional Norse boats, capable of handling both river navigation and ocean storms. The construction nearly bankrupted him. His wife Lagertha, a fierce shield maiden in her own right, initially doubted his obsession. "You're gambling our children's future on sailors' tailies," she warned. But she saw the fire in his eyes, the same intensity that had won her heart in battle. Reluctantly, she began supporting his impossible dream. Working with his brother Rollo and the boat builder Floki, Ragnar spent 2 years perfecting his design. The ship they created was a masterpiece, sleek, fast, and shallow-drafted enough to navigate rivers, while sturdy enough to survive ocean crossings. They called it a longship, and it would revolutionize warfare for centuries. The first expedition nearly killed them all. Sailing into the unknown western waters, they encountered storms that dwarfed anything they'd experienced in the Baltic. For days, they battled waves the size of mountains while their provisions dwindled. Many crew members begged to turn back. But Ragnar pressed on, driven by an unshakable conviction that destiny waited beyond the horizon. Then, through the morning mist, they saw it, the coastline of England. Rolling green hills, peaceful villages, monasteries fat with treasures, and defended by monks who'd never held weapons. It was a Viking's paradise, undefended and overflowing with wealth. The raid on Lindisfarne Monastery in 793 AD was swift and brutal. The English had grown soft under centuries of peace, their armies unprepared for the lightning-fast attacks of Viking raiders. Ragnar and his men loaded their longships with more gold, silver, and precious artifacts than they'd ever dreamed possible. But more importantly, they'd proven that Ragnar's vision wasn't madness, it was genius. When they returned to Kattegat, the very people who'd mocked Ragnar as a delusional farmer now hailed him as a visionary. Earl Haraldsson's face went pale when he saw the treasure. In a single expedition, this upstart farmer had accomplished more than the traditional Eastern raids achieved in a decade. But success came with a price. Haraldsson, consumed by jealousy and fear of losing power, began plotting against Ragnar. The old guard couldn't tolerate being shown up by a farmer who dared to think beyond tradition. Political intrigue swirled around Kattegat as Ragnar's growing influence threatened the established order. Ragnar faced a choice that would define his legacy: remain a successful raider and live safely under another man's authority, or risk everything to claim the leadership his achievements had earned. He chose revolution, challenging Haraldsson to single combat for the right to rule Kattegat. The duel was fierce, but brief. Haraldsson, an experienced warrior, initially dominated with conventional techniques. But Ragnar fought with the desperate creativity that had driven him across unknown seas. In the end, it wasn't superior skill that won. It was the absolute refusal to accept limitations that others took for granted. With Haraldsson's death, Ragnar became Earl of Kattegat. The farmer who'd once struggled to feed his family now commanded fleets that would terrorize coastlines from Ireland to Constantinople. But this was only the beginning of a journey that would take him to heights of power he'd never imagined, and depths of betrayal that would break his heart. What do you think about this transformation so far? Can you imagine the courage it took for a simple farmer to challenge everything his society believed? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious about your perspective on taking such massive risks for a dream. Power, as Ragnar would soon discover, was far more complex than conquest. By 830 AD, he'd established himself as one of the most feared Viking leaders in Scandinavia. His longships prowled the coasts of England, Ireland, and Francia, bringing back impossible wealth that transformed Kattegat from a modest settlement into a thriving port city. But with success came temptations that would slowly poison his soul. The first crack in his armor was pride. Each successful raid inflated his ego further, until Ragnar began believing his own legend. He started making decisions based on glory, rather than wisdom, pursuing increasingly dangerous expeditions, not for practical gain, but to feed his addiction to fame. The man who once carefully studied raven flight patterns before risking lives now launched campaigns on impulse. His marriage to Lagertha, forged in mutual respect and shared struggle, began deteriorating under the weight of his ambitions. She'd fought beside him when he was nobody, bleeding on foreign shores to build their dream. But now, intoxicated by power, Ragnar grew distant and dismissive. He began taking multiple wives, a common practice for wealthy Vikings, but devastating to a woman who'd sacrificed everything for their shared vision. The breaking point came when Ragnar fell obsessively in love with Aslaug, a mysterious woman who claimed descent from legendary heroes. Aslaug was beautiful, intelligent, and politically connected, everything an ambitious king needed in a queen. But she was also manipulative, slowly poisoning Ragnar's relationships with his oldest allies while positioning her own sons for future power. Lagertha saw through Aslaug's schemes immediately. "She doesn't love you, Ragnar," she warned during one of their final conversations. "She loves what you represent: power, wealth, status. When those things crumble, she'll abandon you, faster than a sinking ship." But Ragnar, blinded by infatuation, dismissed her concerns as jealousy. When Lagertha finally left, taking their son Bjorn with her, something fundamental broke inside Ragnar. He'd lost the one person who'd believed in him when he was nothing, the warrior who'd bled beside him when victory seemed impossible. In pursuing everything, he'd sacrificed the only relationship that truly mattered. But personal betrayal was only the beginning. As his sons grew older, raised largely by Aslaug, while Ragnar campaigned across Europe, they developed their own ambitions. Ivar, born with brittle bones but possessing a brilliant tactical mind, resented his father's pity. Ubbe and Hvitserk chafed under living in the shadow of their legendary father. Even Bjorn, when he occasionally visited, seemed more interested in proving himself than learning from Ragnar's experiences. The political landscape was shifting as well. The English kingdoms, initially caught off guard by Viking tactics, had spent decades learning how to counter Norse raids. Kings like Alfred of Wessex implemented new military strategies, building fortified towns and professional armies specifically designed to combat Viking invasions. What had once been easy conquests became brutal, costly sieges. Ragnar's greatest ambition, conquering Paris, became his most humiliating defeat. The city's massive walls, defended by experienced soldiers and advanced siege weapons, proved impenetrable to traditional Viking assault tactics. After months of futile attacks, Ragnar's army was decimated by disease and starvation. He returned to Kattegat broken, his reputation tarnished, his men questioning his judgment for the first time. The defeat in Paris shattered something deep inside Ragnar. He began drinking heavily, spending days in brooding silence while his kingdom's affairs went unmanaged. Aslaug, seeing weakness, started making decisions without consulting him, gradually assuming control while undermining his authority with their sons. The final betrayal came from an unexpected source: his own achievements. The wealth and territory Ragnar had conquered attracted ambitious rivals who saw opportunity in his decline. Neighboring jarls began forming alliances against him, while his own people grew restless under increasingly erratic leadership. Farmer who'd once united Vikings behind a bold vision now found himself isolated and surrounded by enemies. In his darkest moments, Ragnar realized the terrible truth. He'd become everything he'd once opposed. The established rulers he'd overthrown for their complacency and blindness to possibility had been replaced by something worse. A tyrant so obsessed with personal glory that he'd forgotten why he'd started fighting in the first place. But perhaps the most crushing realization was how completely he'd failed his children. Instead of teaching them the values that had driven his own success, curiosity, courage, and the willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, he'd provided only wealth and reputation. His sons respected his legend, but had never truly known their father as a man. As Ragnar entered his 50s, worn down by decades of warfare and poisoned by the very success he'd sought, he faced the consequences of every choice he'd made. The farmhouse where he'd once dreamed of western lands felt like a prison. The throne he'd killed to claim had become a burden, and the family he'd thought he was building had fractured beyond repair. Thank you for staying with this story so far. Your engagement means everything, and I promise the most powerful part is still ahead. What you're about to discover will change how you think about legacy forever. By 845 AD, Ragnar Lothbrok was a broken man living inside a legend's reputation. The fire that had once driven him across unknown seas had dimmed to barely glowing embers. He spent his days wandering the halls of Kattegat like a ghost, haunted by memories of what he'd accomplished and tortured by the knowledge of what he'd destroyed in the pursuit of greatness. His relationship with Aslaug had deteriorated into cold political calculation. She ruled through their sons while maintaining the pretense of marriage, but there was no love left between them, if there ever had been. His children viewed him with a mixture of respect and resentment, seeing him more as an obstacle to their own ambitions than as a father worthy of affection. But it was during this dark period that Ragnar made perhaps the most brilliant decision of his entire life, one that would ensure his legacy lasted far beyond his physical death. He began planning what appeared to be his most foolish expedition yet, a return to England with just 2 ships and a handful of loyal warriors. Everyone who heard the plan assumed Ragnar had finally lost his mind. Why would the most experienced Viking raider in history attempt such a suicidal mission? His sons begged him to reconsider. Aslaug accused him of abandoning his responsibilities, and his advisors warned that failure would destroy what remained of his reputation. What they didn't understand was that Ragnar wasn't planning to succeed, at least not in the way they imagined success. He'd studied his sons carefully and recognized their potential, but also their limitations. Ivar possessed tactical genius, but lacked the unifying vision that could rally armies. Bjorn had inherited his father's courage, but not his strategic thinking. Ub and Hitsark were capable warriors, but followers rather than leaders. Ragnar realized that only a great injustice could forge them into the unified force capable of surpassing his achievements. And sometimes, the greatest leaders must sacrifice themselves to create the circumstances their successors need to flourish. The journey to England was deliberately reckless. Ragnar's small fleet sailed during storm season, took unnecessary risks, and made tactical errors that any experienced raider would have avoided. When they reached the English coast, they walked directly into King Eil's trap with almost theatrical inevitability. Captured by overwhelming numbers, Ragnar found himself chained in the court of the Northumbrian king who'd spent years dreaming of this moment. El had prepared elaborate tortures, intending to make Ragnar's death a spectacle that would discourage future Viking raids. The centerpiece was a pit filled with venomous serpents, a death designed to be both agonizing and symbolically appropriate for the serpent who terrorized Christian lands. But as they lowered him toward the writhing mass of snakes, something extraordinary happened. Instead of the broken, desperate pleading El expected, Ragnar began to laugh. Not the bitter laughter of madness, but the deep, satisfied chuckle of a man who just played his final card in a game decades in the making. "You think you're killing Ragnar Lothbrok," he told his captors as the serpents began their deadly work. "But you're actually giving birth to something far more terrible. My sons will avenge me with such fury that your descendants will curse the day you were born. Every English mother will teach her children to fear the names of Ivar the Boneless, Baborn Ironside, Ub, and Hitsark. You haven't ended the Viking threat. You've created an unstoppable force that will make my raids look like gentle summer breezes." El dismissed these words as the desperate boasting of a dying man. He couldn't have been more wrong. News of Ragnar's execution reached Kattegat like lightning striking dry wood. The sons who'd spent years resenting their father's overshadowing presence suddenly understood what they'd lost. More importantly, they finally had the unifying cause that could channel their individual strengths into collective power. Ivar, the crippled son who'd always felt inadequate compared to his warrior brothers, revealed the strategic brilliance Ragnar had secretly cultivated. He began planning not just revenge, but conquest on a scale that would dwarf anything their father had achieved. Bjorn embraced the leadership role he'd always avoided, becoming the inspirational figurehead their armies needed. Ub and Hitsark transformed from resentful siblings into loyal lieutenants, willing to subordinate their egos for the greater cause. The great heathen army they assembled was unprecedented in Viking history. Over 3,000 warriors united under a single banner, equipped with the finest weapons and motivated by righteous fury. When they landed in England in 865 AD, they didn't come as raiders seeking quick plunder. They came as conquerors determined to claim kingdoms. The campaign that followed was systematic and devastating. They conquered York, destroyed the kingdom of East Anglia, and forced every English ruler to acknowledge Viking supremacy. When they finally captured King El, Ivar's revenge was artistic in its cruelty. The blood eagle execution that left Eäl's ribs torn open like wings, while his lungs were pulled out and spread across his back. But the true genius of Ragnar's sacrifice became clear in the decades that followed. His sons didn't just avenge his death. They established dynasties that ruled from Ireland to Russia. Bjorn explored the Mediterranean. Ivar conquered much of England, and their descendants would influence European politics for centuries. Ragnar had achieved something no amount of personal glory could have accomplished. By choosing the right death, at the right moment, He'd transformed his children from competitors into collaborators, his legacy from a single generation's achievements into an eternal bloodline of kings. The story of Ragnar Lothbrok teaches us that true legacy isn't measured by what we accomplish in our lifetimes, but by what we inspire others to achieve after we're gone. His greatest victory wasn't conquering England or accumulating wealth. It was recognizing that sometimes the most powerful thing a leader can do is step aside and let the next generation exceed their accomplishments. Think about your own life for a moment. What kind of legacy are you building? Are you so focused on personal achievement that you're forgetting to nurture the potential in others? Are you brave enough to take risks on dreams that seem impossible? Like that farmer who dared to sail west into unknown waters? Ragnar's journey from farmer to legend reminds us that our current circumstances don't define our potential. Our willingness to challenge limitations does. But it also warns us that success without wisdom can become its own trap, and that the relationships we sacrifice for ambition might be the very things that give our achievements meaning. What lesson from Ragnar's story resonates most with you? Are you more inspired by his early courage, troubled by his middle-age struggles, or moved by his final sacrifice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one and love hearing your perspectives on these historical lessons. If this story challenged your thinking about courage, ambition, and legacy, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. We explore fascinating historical figures every week, always looking for the human truths that can transform how we understand our own potential. And make sure to watch our next recommended video about the individual stories of Ragnar's sons. You'll be amazed at how each of them channeled their father's lessons into their own unique path to greatness. The revenge they orchestrated was just the beginning of dynasties that would reshape medieval Europe in ways Ragnar himself never imagined. Until next time, remember, sometimes the greatest victory is knowing when to let others surpass your own achievements.